This meeting will now come to order. I wish you all a good afternoon and welcome to today's hearing on expanding research to improve water use efficiency and conservation. The Subcommittee is here to receive testimony on H.R. 3957, the Water Use Efficiency and Conservation Research Act of 2007, introduced by my good friend Jim Matheson. Congressman, I want to thank you for your hard work and interest on this important subject. All of the world is covered by some 70% water and less than 3% of it is fresh water. According to the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, a mere 0.007% of the Earth's total freshwater resources is accessible for human. Pollution and salinization enhanced by drought conditions only serve to decrease the water available for our use. Drought and scarce water supplies have long been a problem for my home state of Texas. Population growth, increased energy demand, and climate change impacts are further endangering my state's limited supplies. I think this is the first year in many that there has not been significant drought in any place in the state of Texas. The Texas Water Development Board estimates demand for water use will exceed water supply in Texas by the year 2050. This story is repeating itself across the country. This year's epic drought in the southeast threatens the water supply for millions. Water levels in the Great Lakes have been declining. Upstate New York's reservoirs have dropped to record lows. And in the west, the mountain snowpack is melting earlier and faster, affecting fresh water supplies for all those who rely on rivers fed by snowmelt-fed rivers. We can't solve these problems overnight, but H.R. 3957 will provide us with several important tools to address the coming crisis with technology and innovative thinking. By encouraging research and development into water use efficiency, we can create a path to increase our nation's water supplies. Investing in water use efficiency strategies requires some expenditure now, but in the long run, conserving water provides substantial cost savings for governments and the American public. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that if all U.S. households installed water-efficient appliances, the country would save more than 3 trillion gallons of water and more than $17 billion per year. I want to thank our distinguished panel for traveling to testify at this afternoon's hearing. I look forward to your testimony and to your recommendations as to how we can make better use of our scarce water resources. Thank you, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Inglis, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I also appreciate Mr. Matheson's work to introduce H.R. 3957, the Water Use Efficiency and Conservation Research Act. Excuse me. This bill highlights the need to think more conservatively about invaluable water resources. We don't have to look far to realize the devastating effects of water shortages and what they can do to our lives. The fires that threaten and destroy California, droughts that debilitate crops in South Carolina and a number of other southeastern states, and global citizens who have to travel farther and farther to reach fresh water. By supporting research and development into enhanced water use efficiency and water conservation, the federal government can help improve our national and global response to water shortages. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the type of research and technologies best suited to meet this goal. Mr. Chairman, I've also asked the Environmental Protection Agency, the agency tasked with carrying out the provisions of this bill, to look at the legislation and provide comments on it. Since the agency was not asked to provide a witness today, I think it only appropriate that we agree to take their comments into consideration as we move the bill through the legislative process. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to discussing the bill with the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Inglis, and I certainly will take note of your request. It makes sense. I ask unanimous consent that all additional opening statements submitted by the subcommittee members be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. And it's my pleasure to introduce our witnesses today, and we'll start with Dr. Glen Daigger, who is Senior Vice President with CH2M Hill, I always get them mixed up, CH2M Hill, where he's currently the Chief Technology Officer for the firm's civil infrastructure businesses. He is also a technology fellow in wastewater treatment. serving as Senior Consultant and Process Engineer on municipal and industrial wastewater treatment and reclamation projects. Mr. Ed Clerico is a water reuse expert and accredited LEED professional, licensed professional engineer and licensed wastewater operator in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Mr. Clerico is currently president of Alliance Environmental, a consulting group that focuses on green building concepts. And at this time, we have several members here today who will be introducing the remainder of our witnesses. First, I'd like to yield to the author of H.R. 3957, Mr. Matheson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm pleased to introduce a constituent of mine, Ron Thompson, who's the district manager of the Washington County Water Conservancy District. Mr. Thompson participates on so many different boards and associations. I'm not sure I can read through all of them, but I want to tell you this is an individual who faces some real challenges in a county that is one of the fastest growing counties in the United States, and it's also one of the most arid counties in the United States. And he has a wealth of experience and knowledge about how to meet those challenges with a portfolio approach. One piece of that portfolio has to do with conservation and efficiency, and so I'm pleased he could come here today and participate as a witness on this panel. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Matheson. The gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Giffords.
Thank you, Mr. Who is the director of the Water Conservation Alliance of Southern Arizona, also known as Water CASA. She's also a principal research specialist with the University of Arizona's College of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. She's the author of numerous water use efficiency publications and has worked internationally on water conservation issues ranging from the Middle East to Central America. I've had a chance to work with Ms. Little since my early days in the state legislature, where we collaborated on legislation that created the incentives for home builders to initiate gray water plumbing systems into new home construction. As a leader in our community, particularly coming from the Sonoran Desert where we don't have a lot of water, Ms. Little has been instrumental in bringing diverse stakeholders together to address the future of water in our desert home. So it's my pleasure that she's come all the way from Southern Arizona to be with us today. My staff has also informed me that the students at the University of Arizona are now watching via video teleconference to your testimony. So a shout out to all the students at the University of Arizona for participating via the technology of the internet, and I know that we're all working collaboratively to make sure that our water supply remains secure.
Thank you, Ms. Giffords. And the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Biggert, will introduce our final witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce Mr. John Vail, a respected senior scientist from Argonne National Laboratory and manager of its water policy program. Before joining Argonne, Mr. Vail managed the industrial discharge program for the state of Maryland and was a faculty member in the Department of Zoology at the University of Maryland. His biography has a very distinct Maryland theme. Despite working for Argonne, which is in my district in Illinois, Mr. Vail is a resident of Maryland, but he's a great asset to the laboratory and to the people of Illinois. He and other water experts from Argonne and Purdue University, Calumet City, are currently working with scientists and engineers at BP to explore the application of emerging technologies that could address wastewater treatment challenges faced by the company at its Whiting, Indiana oil refinery on Lake Michigan. And millions get their drinking water from Lake Michigan and the other Great Lakes, so that's why many of us in Congress care deeply about this amazing freshwater resource and why Mr. Vail's contributions to protecting it are so important. I'd like to thank him for being here. Yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Biggert. And I want to thank you and welcome all of our witnesses. We do appreciate you coming. And as you all know, that you'll have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you've completed your testimony, we'll begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. And Mr. Daigger, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll generally follow the written testimony here, but I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak to you today to discuss this very important topic. In my over 30 years of professional experience, I've worked around the U.S. and around the world focusing on clean water and sanitation, so this is an area that is near and dear to my heart. I don't need to discuss the urgent need to provide clean water and sanitation in the United States. You have all expressed that need very well. What it leads to, of course, is conflict between urban and rural areas and people in the environment. We're seeing that certainly in Georgia. What is important is that there are solutions. There are solutions to these issues, and this bill will help to advance those. What we do need, though, is your help to help advance these solutions into practice through demonstration and additional research. So let me provide some perspective in terms of overall directions and how this fits in. Water has historically been managed in urban areas, and public health has been protected by transporting water. There are pristine water sources identified, it's conveyed and to the public, and then it's used to transport waste out of that urban area. There are those that say, well, this is an invention of the 18th and 19th century, but actually you go back to the ancient cities, and this was the approach that was used. So this is something which has been used very, very, throughout the history of mankind to manage water in urban areas. When the population was much lower, and when the burden on the environment was much less, this was really a brilliant solution as in terms of protecting public health. The statistics are very clear in terms of its benefit in terms of creating the standard of living that we have in the U.S., and some of those specific comments are in the testimony. The issue, though, is that with population growth, and particularly the urbanization that we have, this approach is really no longer working for us. But fortunately, again, we have an alternative to transportation of water and wastes, that is treatment, which is sufficiently reliable to be deployed at a more local basis so that we can use and reuse water much more efficiently. Some of the most important treatment systems are membranes, which function much like the kidney in terms of purifying water, ultraviolet disinfection, which mimics sunlight in terms of treating water, and a variety of other technologies. So you might ask, if we have these technologies, what help do we need? The help that we need is to be able to deliver these more quickly into routine practice. And as I talk about that, let me talk a little bit about, I'm a person that is involved in water issues around the world. And I want to talk for a minute about what some other countries are doing. Countries, and this country in decades past has made significant public investments in water research and really created the systems that we have, which have really benefited the world. Countries like France and Canada, Japan, the United Kingdom have emulated that, and quite frankly, a lot of the advances that are occurring are being developed in other countries. Right now, for example, the Republic of Singapore, with only 4.5 million people, is investing $330 million in research. Korea is investing $140 million a year in their water research. So give that a perspective. What we need is really three things. One is help to demonstrate. The second is help to further advance this technology through things like nanotechnology and biotechnology. And then finally, quite frankly, we need help in terms of our academic investments to maintain a healthy academic system. At the conclusion of my written testimony, I'm just reiterate that I think something on the order of $100 million in terms of R&D investment, and the academic community needs about $20 million a year in order to support the faculty and the professionals that we need graduating to continue this wonderful profession that exists in the U.S. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Daigger. It just seems like it's a recurring theme that we hear, that we're spending less in science and other nations are spending more.
Yes, sir.
Reverse that again. Mr. Thompson.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm from Southwest Utah, and to it's often said that it's so dry there our desert tortoises pack canteens. So water is very important, and we're in an area that's growing very quickly. We've gone from 13,000 people in 1970 to approximately 160,000 people today. 1 out of every 4 homes is owned by what we call a seasonal resident, or snowbirds as we refer to them. The water conservation in the arid desert that I come from is very important. Our average rainfall is about 8 inches. The last several years it's been much less than that. So our district's been hard involved in educating the public towards water conservation. It seems to me as we look at that, I would just share a couple of observations of where I think technology has taken us today in the water conservation arena from my perspective. We have a wastewater treatment plant in an area that probably 70% of our population lives. Over the last, since 1990, our population area has more than doubled. Our impact in that inflow into that plant is increased about 15%. I think that's really a combination of 2 factors. One is technology, the low-flow appliances, low-flow fixtures, and the second has been a extensive and hard public education program to the people, encouraging them to conserve water and to use it more wisely. Certainly, as we look west-wide and look at this nation, whatever you want to say, we're not going to outgrow our water supply. It is, in fact, the lubricant that makes our economy thrive and protects and provides health and safety to our citizens. So the wise use of that water is a fact that we all have a pretty big investment in, regardless of where we're at. And the more mobile we are, we expect everyone's water supply to be adequate to meet our needs, regardless of what the cost is. I think that if I was going to talk about anything, certainly I think technology is important, and we actually have just put on a wastewater reuse plant, a 10 million gallon a day plant, which we integrate into a secondary system. But it seems to me as we look at conservation, we also need to remember there's some other impacts to conservation that aren't all that great, and I want to share those. One is we need to remember that conservation is just dry and taking every drop of water and returning none to the environment. And in our conservation plan, we actually take about 10% of what we conserve and put it back into in-stream flows and other environmental needs. The second thing is we traditionally in the West had this policy that people, when they were overusing water and we got in a crisis like we've been in the last years of the drought, we could ask people to conserve, cut that use back, and pick up a 15 or 20% savings for 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. The more people conserve, the better job they do, the more hardened our water supply has to come. So we no longer have a surplus capacity in our water supply system. We're using that up, and that requires, as water managers, that we have to harden that water supply. And of course, the other issue is what is the cost. As you start encouraging people to take out turf, replace it with concrete, what is the cost of that, which in many cases would be significant. I think to talk about what I think really works, I think education works, and we in our district put a lot of money into education. And not just for the sake of education, but we don't believe that people will act without having been adequately educated in a lot of arenas. We have encouraged and required cities who buy water from us to have water conservation plans that require tiered rate structures. We've put impact fees, so people who use more water have to pay a higher impact fee. Entered into conservation agreements for those who will commit to use a water-wise landscape that allows them to pay a lesser impact fee. We've imposed a time of day watering, which is saved, and then we've have had improved technology. All of those, we believe, work, but I would say if you look at the whole arena, education probably is the most important single factor, because my observation, the more educated the public is on this issue, the more they buy into it, the more they publicly support our expenditures in this arena. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Clerico.
Thank you. I've taken the risk here, a brief presentation of showing you some visual images. I think it segues nice with the discussion we just had. And I noticed the bottled water we all have at our stands. And I ask you, you know, recently it was in the news how our tap water is equal in quality to bottled water, something the industry was really glad to hear. We knew that all along. But it made me stop and think, then why are we flushing our toilets with it? And it's something I really want you to ponder, because the work I've done over the years has demonstrated that there's so much more we can be doing that could be better. So I've invented the dual flush toilet, which I say is the quintessential dual flush toilet for America, because it represents the fact that if you really were given a choice, would you flush your toilet with bottled water? Well, the answer is no. And the fact is, we really don't have to be, because there's many other choices available. For the past 20 years, I've been working hard in this industry, and the progress has been good, but the progress has been slow due to the lack of innovation within the industry itself, and that's part of this conversation today around the research. I've built 30 water reuse systems in that time frame, and the conservation aspect of these systems range from 50% reduction in use for residential to 95% reduction in use for commercial institutional facilities. Well, as a result of this work, this is a diagram, which I don't know that we have the time to spend here today talking about, but essentially what we're doing is we're mining sewage and we're mining stormwater, treating it and then reusing it for non-potable purposes within buildings. And there's a lot of this going on related to the green building industry. And the green building industry has really played a leadership role in innovation, but if we had the research behind that, I think the country as a whole could step up, and we're seeing other countries go faster and more beyond us, and many of the products we're buying are coming from overseas because the American manufacturers aren't supplying them. But in essence, this diagram represents how you would take wastewater from within a building or within a neighborhood, treat it, and then return it directly back for flushing toilets, for laundry, and for cooling towers. And we're getting tremendous results from the systems that we have of this nature, and the economics are actually playing out favorably now today that there are no construction grants programs anymore, and the municipalities are starting to pay full price for the water and wastewater facilities. Now we're cost competitive. There's many advantages. It's eliminating long collection lines and distribution pipes which are inefficient and which leak and which are expensive. It helps us mitigate existing problems with combined sewer overflow. And we're removing nutrients so that we're actually doing a better job of protecting the environment while we're saving water. It's not just about water, it's about the environment and pollution in general. The drawbacks are, when you do this on small scale, you do lose some economy of scale. You do require dual plumbing because now you have non-potable water supplying fixtures as well as potable water. I tell you, the Plumbers Union does not have a problem with this because it actually makes for a good economy. And when you start thinking about this whole green building movement, there is a whole economy here related to what could happen if we were in it to innovate and move forward more. And the small systems are generally not subsidized, so we don't have the same level playing field economically because we're competing with subsidized municipal facilities. Now, the New England Patriots Stadium is one I put up because it was a story that came in 2000. It raised the awareness around what's possible with water reuse. The stadium has a complete water reuse system in it. It saved the stadium for the town of Foxborough. They were going to leave if they couldn't solve this problem. It had a tremendous economic advantage to the Route 1 corridor, if you've ever been up to that area of New England, so that they could have some vibrancy even though their water resource was diminished and compromised. And that led then to the green building era in Manhattan, when in Battery Park City they decided they were going to do very innovative water reuse programs as part of urban development. And we now have 4 operating high-rise buildings in Manhattan that are residential. We have 3 either in design or construction. The Solaire was the first. It was America's first gold-rated LEED building for residential high-rise. Over 3 years of data taking, we see a 48% reduction in water use by comparison to a sister building, a sister modern building, using modern plumbing fixtures, and a 56% reduction in wastewater discharge. The difference between the two is we're evaporating a lot of the wastewater in the cooling towers. And once you start looking at the opportunities to reuse water, cooling is a big aspect that hasn't been, the surface hasn't been scratched yet, and there's a lot of need for research there. And as we look at these facilities, we're looking down from the roof on a park that's irrigated with reuse water, on a green roof that's capturing rainwater and reusing it within the building, and on the buildings themselves, you get a sense of how this can actually be tucked into very, very high density as well as very rural areas. It's not about where you do it, It's just a matter of the fact that you can do it if you have the right momentum behind you. This picture just shows you how we build systems right into the foundations of building. The membrane technology that Dr. Daigger referred to has really helped us advance quickly, but there's so much more distance to go in terms of our research around energy consumption and practical applications to optimize these systems. We can't take another 20 years to advance this. We need to do something on a much more accelerated basis to be successful. We have found that at a scale of about 500,000 gallons a day, we're actually economical. We're more economical today than in New York City, continuing with city services. The city has recognized the advantage here, and they've given us an incentive for water reuse. It's a 25% reduction in our water and wastewater bills. And this graph represents a building. The yellow line would be if you did water reuse, and the blue line would be if you were using city services. That would be for a large 10 million square foot facility, which some of the neighborhoods in New York City are. So you can see there's an economic advantage. You go to a smaller scale system, the economics are okay, but they're not quite as attractive. And the city is now considering doing a capital incentive program to incentivize developers to do more of this, because it hasn't cost the city anything, and they're benefiting from reduced demand on their water supply and on their wastewater infrastructure, and they realize that in the future the city intends to add 1 million people and 750,000 jobs by 2030. And in the course of doing that, they need to remove 60 million gallons per day of water consumption, which is a 5% reduction. So they know that they need innovative solutions like this if that's going to happen. And it's interesting this would be happening in New York City. It can happen everywhere where waters are concerned and where environmental discharges are concerned. It just doesn't have to be a one-city solution. Research is an important component of this. As I mentioned, the energy-water nexus needs to be researched further, so as we develop our new systems, we're effective in terms of how we manage our energy relative to our water management. There's many new applications. As I mentioned, cooling towers. We have interesting conversations with cooling tower manufacturers. We could sure use some university support around what could be done better to integrate the various functions of how we use water with how we can treat our water for reuse. And that's what I had to tell you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clerico. Ms. Little.
Comment on the practices to improve. Okay, now we go. This hearing could not be more timely, and the Water CASA members I represent here today appreciate your leadership and your interest in the efficient uses of the water supplies throughout the nation. I want to begin with a very direct statement. Cheapest source of water is that which you don't have to find, buy, treat, transport, or deliver. That's sort of a credo that Water CASA works around. Regarding comments on R&D needs to enhance water use efficiency and water conservation, first of all, we believe that this committee should use the over 200 members of the Watersense program, their program partners, to assist the EPA in prioritizing the specific national needs in the area of applied research in this area. Secondly, we believe that sound decision-making requires that national policymakers know which areas of the country or which demographic profiles have the highest potential for increased water use efficiency, and also which programmatic efforts or processes used in these target areas will generate the most bang for the buck. Dollars are scarce, and we've got to be very rigorous in where those dollars are allocated. Research can provide those answers. Members of Water CASA support all the technological efforts to save water, but we readily acknowledge the limits to technology. Human behavior factor can easily trump any technical strategy we devise through the inadequate monitoring, management, and maintenance of the technological tools. In general, water conservation technologies are far ahead of our ability to educate and train the users and the consumers in the effective use of these tools. A national effort to lessen this disparity is essential. Water CASA strongly supports research efforts in the water conservation arena that offer actual and quantifiable results rather than projected or modeled assumption. Wise decision-making requires it. Regarding the EPA's Watersense program, this is an effective effort that Water CASA has supported since its inception, counting ourselves among the founding promotion partners. Specifications, licensing, labeling, and publication are all great tools for us in the field. So we say, do more, do faster. Additionally, Water CASA will back any increase in training and certification efforts for all professional in the use of the appropriate technologies touted by Watersense. Again, the efficiency to be gained by our technologies is limited by our ability to have qualified and capable humans monitoring, managing, and maintaining them. Regarding Representative Matheson's draft legislation, my eyes lit up when I saw the word gray water. Gray water is something we work a great deal with in southern Arizona. The potential water savings to be had from residential gray water reuse is an estimated 35 gallons per person per day, which translates easily into 50,000 gallons per household per year. It's far too compelling a water source to ignore. National standards and regulations regarding the reuse of gray water generated in residences should be promulgated, much as we have done in Arizona. As with gray water, the potential savings to our potable water supplies through maximum utilization of harvested rainfall is astounding. In urban areas of Pima County, the amount of rainfall that could be captured from rooftops, paving, landscaped areas, and bare ground is equivalent to over 75% of the water delivered to that same urban area by the water provider. The Arizona model of providing incentives to increase the use of household gray water and the harvesting of rainwater can form the basis for national policy. These incentives can be tailored to motivate home builders, prospective home buyers, and existing homeowners as well. Water CASA agrees that water conservation should certainly be a national goal, and we welcome any opportunity to work with not only the EPA, but with all federal agencies that have water-related mandates. We support workshops to offer input to EPA on what the national water use efficiency goals ought to be, and establishing an R&D roadmap to reach these goals. Finally, a few suggestions that aren't directly R&D related. We believe there should be a national goal of 100% metered water use in this nation. We believe that all water providers should be required to have some form of conservation rate structure, whether it's a seasonal rate differential, a time-of-day pricing, inclining block rates, or surcharges tied to usage. We think that all water suppliers should be required to keep their system leakage below 10% of the water they deliver. And we would like to see the speed up of the change out of pre-1990 toilets that are high water using in existing structures through the use of incentives, and phase in a national requirement to retrofit to HET toilets at the time of resale. Approve additional plumbing standards that reflect structured plumbing system components that save considerable water and energy as well. Today, the public is paying attention to water issues as never before. A national public awareness campaign is needed, and needed now. You as federal lawmakers have the opportunity to create a national conservation ethic that reinforces the work that we do at the state and regional level. In closing, the protection of our environmental assets, particularly our water supplies, must be given the highest consideration in all of our programmatic decisions, for it is actually our own self-protection and the protection of generations to come that we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Little. Mr. Vail.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon on produced water, an important source of water for our nation that's not currently mentioned in H.R. 3957. Over the next few minutes, I'll describe some ways in which produced water is currently being beneficially reused and the need for additional research to allow further reuse of produced water. Produced water is water that's already in the underground formation with the oil and gas, and when the oil and gas is brought to the surface, the produced water comes along with it. The major constituent of concern in produced water, from the standpoint of beneficial reuse, is the salt content. Produced water is the largest volume byproduct stream associated with oil and gas production. In the United States, up to 2.3 billion gallons per day of produced water are generated. By comparison, in the D.C. metropolitan area, the D.C. government and the WSSC provide about 300 million gallons per day of drinking water to local residents. This represents only about 13% of the daily produced water volume for the nation. There are many options for managing produced water, but today I will focus my remarks on ways in which produced water is being and can be reused. First off is underground injection for increasing oil recovery. This is the most widely used approach for managing onshore produced water. The water is reinjected back into a producing formation. It serves to maintain reservoir pressure and hydraulically drive oil toward a collection well. The practice is referred to as enhanced oil recovery or water flooding. If the oil and gas operators did not have produced water to use for this enhanced recovery, they would need to rely on other surface or groundwater supplies to make up that water. A second important use is agricultural. Many oil and gas wells are located in areas of the country that are characterized by arid climates and scarce freshwater resources. Produced water meeting the water quality requirements of agricultural users offer the potential to supplement and replace existing water supplies. Perhaps the most significant barrier to using produced water for agriculture involves the salt content of the water. Most crops and livestock do not tolerate much salt, and continued irrigation with salty water can damage the soil structure. The third area I want to mention is use for drinking water. Texas A&M University developed a portable produced water treatment trailer that can be moved into the oil fields to convert produced water to potable water. During the past few years, this trailer has been taken out into the field in several locations in Texas for pilot studies. The water treated by the trailer met the applicable drinking water standards in every case. There are other methods of reusing produced water described in my written testimony. In spite of the many actual uses for produced water, a large proportion of produced water is being disposed of in ways that offer little beneficial reuse. Although some sources of produced water have low enough dissolved solids that they can be used for irrigation or for drinking with minimal treatment, most U.S. produced water has high enough dissolved solids that significant treatment must be provided before the water can be reused. Government-funded and corporate-funded research have helped to develop and improve technologies for removing dissolved solids from produced water. While the cost of these technologies has dropped in recent years, they are still expensive compared to the alternative of injecting produced water underground for disposal. The bill under consideration in today's hearing is H.R. 3957. The bill promotes research, development, education, and technology transfer activities related to water use efficiency and conservation technologies. I fully support those goals. However, H.R. 3957 does not include any mention or consideration of produced water. Produced water is available in large volume, often in some of the most arid parts of the country. It represents a valuable water resource. With suitable treatment, produced water can be beneficially reused to support various end uses. I encourage the subcommittee to carefully consider produced water as an additional source of water that can be part of the research programs envisioned by H.R. 3957. In particular, the program should support development of technologies that can remove dissolved solids so that produced water can be reused for agriculture, irrigation, human consumption, or other purposes. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you very much. Even though it's not mentioned in this legislation that we're talking about here, there is legislation. Representative Hall has, well, I didn't see him come in. Welcome, Mr. Hall. But he does have legislation, and this certainly should be given serious consideration. Good bill. At this point, we're open for our first round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Would like to ask of Dr. Daigger first, and then perhaps all of you may want to comment on this. It's just a general question. But in your testimony, you write, the United States led the world in developing and implementing revolutionary water management systems throughout the second half of the 20th century. The question before us is whether the U.S. is going to give up its leadership in this critical area. And this is the path that we are on. But it can be reversed with a fairly modest set of actions by the federal government. Can you talk for a bit about what those actions are that would reverse this trend? And the rest of you feel free to chime in.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the question, because from my perspective, it really goes to the heart of the matter here. The question is how much investment in R&D that will help translate some of the wonderful advances that are occurring in some of the fundamental sciences into advances that then can be picked up by the private sector and delivered to consumers. If you look at, I mentioned membrane technology as an example. Membrane technology, and Mr. Clerico showed you an example of how membrane technology in its current form is being applied and in some very innovative ways. That technology, though, is really just the start. If we look at the advances that are occurring in things like nanotechnology and biotechnology, what is needed is some investment to help take those advances and for our water scientists to translate that into the fundamental research that will apply to the water industry so that then those can be then further converted into much more higher performing systems that will fit into the types of applications that Mr. Clerico described. You might ask why private industry wouldn't fund that slice of research. The answer is that the benefits of that research will be broadly available, and it's not possible for private industry to capture the return on that particular investment. Once that research is completed, though, it will allow private industry then to build the businesses and so forth, and quite frankly, through tax revenue to repay the public investment. We've seen this time and again in this country, and again, this is the model that countries like Singapore and Korea are adopting, and that countries like Canada and France and so forth have used it in the past. The other aspect of this is because we haven't had, for the last several years, funding of this type of research. To a certain extent, we're starting to lose the academics, because a successful academic needs research to publish, and they need research to fund their students. And the $20 million that I mentioned is actually, we have a working group within the Water Environment Federation that is looking at this, at the need for professionals in the future. So that's actually based on some fairly rigorous math in terms of the funding for faculty and therefore students to provide the professionals that we need to continue forward. Finally, this is something which the federal government has done in the past. The U.S. federal government has done in the past, and it was that research that allowed us to develop the systems and so forth that we have that that have benefited both the country, but also that have created the opportunity for us to serve the rest of the world. And I have every confidence that with support from the federal government, that innovation engine can be restarted, both to our benefit in terms of water resources, but again, it will pay itself back in terms of the economic activity that it develops.
I just want to comment.
Very briefly, just to supplement, not to repeat anything, that there's also the research component to do with developing standards in the public health aspect. In my regards, with regards to water reuse, it's been a long, hard fight to convince people that this really works. And if there was the research to develop national standards, which the rest of the world has always looked to us towards as being leaders in adopting these type of standards, and now we're starting to look to other countries that are developing the standards before us, and I don't think that's healthy.
Well, how about the social barriers to implementing various reuse programs and policies? Would you talk about that for a minute? How does the acceptability of technologies impact their use, and how can the federal government help to encourage Americans to use existing technologies?
Well, I've seen specifically through my experience, particularly with the green building movement, people's willingness to innovate in terms of their willingness to use new things, and with the water reuse systems we have in place, they're some of the highest value properties you're going to find, and they're acceptable in those applications. So I think we've broken the barrier around acceptability, because it's been going on for enough years in places where I don't think anyone can question it's not going to be good enough for me, because it's been good enough already for people long enough. So I think the research would just help us educate more people quicker. As I said, we just can't take another 20 years. It's been a long, hard fight.
Thank you very much. My time has expired, and I now recognize Mr. English for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 10 years ago, when we were building a house, I asked our builder about putting in a gray water system, and I think I asked when the septic tank people were present too, and they looked at me like I had grown an extra head or maybe some other appendage. They're thinking, do what? And I said, well, maybe we could reuse some of the water. It just basically, it was a non-starter, shall we say. They said it just wouldn't work right. It wouldn't be no real need to. So to some extent, I guess necessity is a mother of invention, right? So if you're in some of the arid climates where you're from, rather than South Carolina, which we're at the top of the water, the streams, we drink it and we flush there, and then it goes down the river, and they use it in Columbia, and then it goes down to the beach. And we're right at the start, up there at the top of the streams, right? And so maybe everybody figures, well, we got plenty, so we'll just keep doing it the way we've been doing it. So it occurs to me that really what's going to drive this mostly is necessity, right? I mean, if you're in Arizona, you really need to do something. If you're in South Carolina, at the top of the headwaters, maybe it's not so imperative or you don't feel. And then Ms. Little testified that she says that basically the greatest impact is going to come from human behavioral change rather than technology. So I wonder if that being the case, I think that's probably true. That really what's going to happen is when people decide that this is something they want to do, maybe I should have insisted 10 years ago on a gray water system. Of course, I couldn't afford the irrigation system that would go with it, so it would have been just sitting there all these 10 years. But we would have put it in the drain field, I guess. Anyhow, I wonder if it is that I guess I'm wondering about the efficacy of this research. I trust that research will give some breakthroughs, but it's being done in a lot of places. So, for example, Furman University has a very exciting project in a science building where they're going to, flush, and then it's going to come back in the building, it's drinking water, after going through all these greenhouses and really amazing things. So apparently it's here now. It's available, right? So I'm wondering, tell me a little bit more about why we need to research it when it looks like what we really need to do is just apply it. And the applying it is human behavior, and the human behavior is driven by a felt need, right? So anybody want to respond to that?
Well, I think it's a confidence issue, and it is being done, but it's not being done in a widespread nature, and it's just like the green building movement in general. A lot of things are starting to happen, but they're going to take time, and there's just so much we could do to advance this in a more creative way, in a more open way, so that people would have confidence in what we were doing, and so that we could continue to learn. We've just scratched the surface. So I wouldn't say let's stop here because it's already being done. Well, we've demonstrated that really creative things can be done, but there's so much more if we want to be leaders in this that I suggest we need to move forward aggressively as opposed to just watching everyone else do it.
I actually have some familiarity with South Carolina as well. I was in the mid-'90s. I was on the faculty at Clemson, so upstate South Carolina is an area that I know, and actually they have can have some relatively significant water problems also during dry periods and so forth. You ask a very, very good question. And I think there's an aspect here that we haven't quite articulated. There are a number of ideas and a number of elements of a paradigm change in terms of how water can be managed. And you've spoken to some of them in terms of gray water and so forth. Each of us have spoken to an element of it. It's a little bit like, though, the 7 blind men trying to describe the elephant, in the sense of it is the combination of several of these ideas that can really transform and provide a dramatic change and a dramatic improvement in terms of how water is managed. And until a number of these elements come together, the profession, and I use that term broadly, it's those folks on a broad basis that make decisions about water management. Until some of these systems come together on a larger basis, folks won't get it in terms of how all of these different things can come together into a new paradigm. I was very pleased to see in the bill the proposal of to do demonstrations, because demonstrations are then the aspect that can help pull several elements together to see how a more integrated system can perform at a much, much higher level. Urban areas use about 150 in the U.S. on average. We use about 150 gallons per person per day. That could easily be cut to a third or a fifth. And if you think about then how much more security we would have in terms of drought proofing, and also, quite frankly, how much better off the environment would be if we just left that water in the environment. Many places, including some instances in upstate South Carolina, one of the biggest environmental impacts that we have in the water environment is just the amount of water that we take out. It's not just the quality, it's the quantity. So where this bill would really help is with, from the demonstration side, that will help to provide, we're all tactile learners. We have to see and feel and work with systems. That's really where that will help then how these various systems can come together in terms of a system that can perform at a much higher level.
Ms. Giffords, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems to me that we're all pretty much on the same page. The big challenge is, how do we get these ideas out in the public? How do we get the public-private cooperation and the partnership at the local and the state and the federal level? And these are big challenges, particularly those of us who are in the West. And actually from the University of Arizona, we have Dr. Swetnam was on 60 Minutes just last week talking about forest fires and what's happening, with the impact of global warming on the West as well. So it's really widespread, and our challenge, of course, as policymakers is how do we derive the best and the brightest ideas. So I'd actually like to turn it over to the panel, starting with Val Little. All of you had a chance to talk about some of these creative avenues that you've taken, but I was just hoping that each of you would again just kind of tap into some of the best ideas that perhaps we as a committee then can glean and pull those ideas forward. I know this all relates to Representative Matheson's bill, and this would be the idea, but if you could please touch on those, starting with Val and what you're doing with Water CASA.
Sorry. We're very big in the area of gray water reuse, and to respond to Congressman Inglis's dilemma about building his house, gray water may not be the answer for every house. In his particular part of the country, it may be harvesting rainwater. Certainly there's a lot more rain there than we get in the arid Southwest, so maybe that would be the appropriate innovative technology for you to have tapped into. There's no one-size-fits-all, and there's no easy answer. One of the things that we try to look at in a balanced way within Water CASA are all the tools. There's no easy answer. Rates won't solve all the problems. Research won't solve all the problems. Technology won't. Public information won't. But all the tools that we work with together, it has to be comprehensive and it has to be consistent. That's what I think the opportunity is for all of you with this, maybe not just with this bill, but certainly this is a beginning, and this is something from which to build on. Particularly regarding gray water, It's driven by the public in that particular region that want to reuse their water. They instinctively understand in a desert environment like that, where many of the laundry facilities are very readily accessible, and they have one mesquite tree or one very tough tree, it makes very good common sense to say, why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't I use those 35 gallons of water per day and provide increased shade for my house by using my laundry water? So it's a very simple driver. It's not complicated reclaimed water system. It's driven by the public who had a thirst to know. They wanted to know how to do it, and they wanted to be able to use it legally. And that's what we've worked toward.
To add to that, it seems to me you really have a two-pronged problem in terms of how you deal with it. In our state, we don't allow gray water systems, which I certainly think we should. So you have the education of the regulators and those who determine who can do what within their community, and then you have the general education of the public. I've watched several agencies struggle with the reuse concept, because no question technologically we can take our wastewater systems, treat that water, and bring it back at a quality that's drinkable. The public acceptance of that has not been well received. However, they will receive it to reuse that water in their parks, on their lawns, in their gardens, in their golf courses, and many other places, which takes off the pressure of our other potable water. So there are other things you can do. It seems to me in our area we have a 10 MGD reuse plant that's being blended with irrigation water for secondary water systems, so that our public facilities and that are using this the gray water coming out of that plant, along with a mixture of non-potable ag water to meet those secondary needs that take some of the pressure off. I still think that in the long term, to really be successful, you have to have a very aggressive public education system. In our district, we educate 4th or 5th graders between 2,000 and 3,000 every year in what we call a water fair. We spend time with the teachers in the public education system. We frankly think it ought to be part of the required curriculum, but the school district's been very good in working with the district in those programs, which we bring all the kids to the university campus, and then they spend a whole day on water, whether it's what it takes to treat it or the various aspects of water reuse and where it comes from and how it gets to their tap. Secondly, we've been aggressive not only in our area but in Utah for some time in what we call a Governor's Water Conservation Program, which is fundamentally funded by the bigger water districts in the state. We encourage people to use water more wisely, and we have a series of ads that start usually as people start using water, talking about time-of-day watering and obviously the simple things we can do in our house to save water. And then third, I think you have to follow that up with local landscape ordinances, education of the people, the builders, and the other parts of your community who really control what's going to happen in this arena, so they realize that those options are there and how they can use them and implement them within their own business. I know several years ago, as we developed our water conservation plan, we had the builders, and our biggest builder in the community sat on a citizens task force. And I've watched over the last decade as I've watched his communities build out, and they have become much more water conservation-oriented, more desert landscaping and so forth. He would not have done that. His earlier developments were all water features and lush lawns and lakes, and he's changed dramatically, and I think it's been to both the benefit of the community and to him economically. So there are a lot of things that really still, in my mind, hinge on public education. Because people won't act until they're educated, and once they understand it, often, they usually make the correct decision. My experience is when people understand the facts, they almost inevitably make the correct decision.
I know we're out of time, and perhaps the other panelists can weave maybe the answer into your questions later. But let me just say, in Tucson, where I'm from, we have an initiative on the ballot right now that potentially could really be devastating for economic development, because it's a scare tactic of toilet to tap, And what we see, particularly in areas where you can have initiatives, is the public is moving forward, and they're going to shut down development and growth unless we as policymakers are really smart about this. So we'll know in a couple of weeks what happens with our initiative in Tucson. But for those states, again, that have the ability for the voters to get out and to put their own legislation on the ballot, we've got some real concerns unless we step up and address the real problems.
Well, and I was in a meeting yesterday in my district in Texas where we were talking about stopping development because we have too much water. And in another part of Texas, in Rockwall, I recognize the gentleman, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have kind of a couple of questions. First, Mr. Veal, you said that most produced water is injected into underground formations to maintain reservoir pressure and for enhanced oil recovery. And I'll get back to that in a minute. I don't know if you're talking, how do I associate the word fracking with that? Or tertiary, we hear that a lot when there's wells are low and they go back with a special way to get some that's left there. Have you included all that into your decision that according to your testimony that's injected there for enhanced oil recovery, or is it there for some other reason, disposal or use, or are there other uses for the water? And are those three connected some way?
They're connected somewhat. The fracture water that you mentioned, though, there's a process known as hydraulic fracturing, where you pump large volumes of water.
And electrofraction and water fracking.
Right, and the purpose is to make cracks in the rock so that either the oil or the gas can more readily flow toward the well where you collect it. In certain very tight shale formations, such as the Barnett Shale in Texas, the Fayetteville Shale.
That's what I'm thinking about.
These are, in order to make them productive, you have to take incredibly large volumes of water for the fracture job. I've visited some in Arkansas where they're using over 1 million gallons per frac job. And it's hard to find that kind of water. When you're fracking 5, 10 wells, it's okay, but if you're fracking hundreds of wells, you need to find that water from somewhere. So produced water may serve as a source of water to be partially cleaned and put back in the ground for energy production.
In Barnett, they're not drilling directly through there for some reason. Maybe it's the massiveness of it or something. They're slant holing from around it, as I understand it.
I think that's a strategy to try to produce more gas from one well, but I can't be sure on that.
I'm for that if it's on my 500 acres, which I doubt it will be. But how would enhanced oil recovery be effective if produced water was used in some other capacity, for instance, as non-potable reused water?
I believe that there's plenty of produced water to go around. If we ended up in a situation where you couldn't use produced water for enhanced recovery and you had to find something else, that would create an issue.
And might ask, yes, in my bill, H.R. 24, the Honorable Chairman mentioned a moment ago, 2483, I included a section for research and development for produced water technology. However, in my bill, I give the R&D program to the Department of Energy. Do you have any thoughts about that as to whether that's appropriate for this type of R&D to be maybe in the EPA or the Department of Energy? I've always preferred the Department of Energy over the EPA, but probably may not have thought that one through. What's your idea on that?
Well, sir, I'm going to respectfully decline to answer that, in that that's a matter of policy rather than technical matters, and I defer to the judgment of the panel in this case.
Well, that's what we have the panel for, to tell us how to... But I accept that. But if you ever run against me, I'm going to use it if you I'll yield back my time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Suppose he would be a good politician, though.
Yeah, he'd be all right.
I recognize Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Little, how satisfied are customers, households that have gray water systems installed? Is that something they like, or is it a problem for them?
because it's their option, no one's required to have it, they're very satisfied. They self-sort into households that want to be more water conserving. They have a high conservation ethic, and they really want to do the right thing. So they're satisfied, and they have great pride in their individual systems. Most of them have been developed specifically by them, for them. And I would say the least satisfying part of all our efforts with gray water is the lack of qualified installers and analysts. We get more calls from people saying, we need a plumber, we need someone to come and tell us how to, than we do anything else. And there's a dearth of proper plumbers. And we need green plumbers.
Do you think that would be the case if it was required for a city or for a development to have gray water? Do you think satisfaction level would be equally high?
I think that overall, the majority of the population is not ready yet. And one of the reasons that we worked on a bill to get houses plumbed to accommodate gray water at some later date is because, first of all, because of the huge growth spurt we were in. And in order to get those houses plumbed at the time of construction, which is very inexpensive to do, knowing full well that households who might not even know what gray water is now, 5 years from now, they will be very disappointed if they can't access their sources of gray water and reuse them as costs go up and the climate for water changes.
Thank you. Mr. Clerico, what do you think the incremental cost is in terms of a new house for implementing a gray water system? Maybe in a percentage if you
We're
could think
seeing,
about it.
in the projects we've been involved with, it's probably about a 1% incremental cost on capital for the residential buildings we've been involved with. That they're multifamily, they're not single-family homes, so I couldn't really, it's going to be very site-specific to the exact use. One of the natures of this business is it's very specific to the use and to the technology that's adapted. We've seen about a 1%, and but in the long-term view, as I showed in the slides, we're seeing a very bright economic picture going forward. Just that initial capital cost additional.
Mr. Veal, I have a question about produced water. What's the is there technology that would clean this for residential use, or is it too contaminated to be sent into a residence?
The water, much like other sources of industrial water, can be cleaned. It depends on how much you want to spend to clean it in order to get it clean enough for drinking purposes. That's been the problem so far, is the cost of getting out sufficient pollutants has exceeded the cost of being able to inject it somewhere for disposal. So there's been no incentive on the oil company's side to do it that way.
Thank you. Mr. Daigger, you mentioned membranes and UV and oxidation. How cost effective are those, and how do they compare, say, to desalinization?
Well, the membranes are one form of desalinization, for example. The type of membrane that Mr. Clerico was showing in his system is called an ultrafiltration membrane, which is one which separates, the pores are large enough to separate out particles, but not to filter out dissolved solids. A reverse osmosis membrane, which would be used for desalinization, then has pores that are at the molecular scale and therefore can separate out dissolved constituents. So the desalinization and membranes are somewhat synonymous in the sense that membrane technology today is what's used, but a specific type of membrane system.
So the desal is roughly competitive cost-wise then for, I mean, you're saying they're basically two kinds of the same.
The difference is that the pressure required for a particle separation membrane might be on the order of, let's say, 3 or 4 pounds per square inch. For a reverse osmosis membrane, it might be 150 pounds per square inch. So the amount of energy that's required is significantly different to desalinate compared to the other types of membranes. And they are somewhat more expensive to handle at higher pressure and so forth. I might say that for membrane technology, over the last 10 years, the cost of membranes have come down about tenfold over the last 10 years. That's starting to plateau out in terms of cost because the new generations of, for example, nanotechnology and so forth, again, the critical need to take the advances that are occurring in, for example, nanotechnology, do that slice of research that will bring that into the water industry. I think you can see one tenfold reduction, how that can change the game. Another tenfold reduction could, again, really change the game. And that's the type of opportunity that there is for us to really transform how we manage water.
Thank you.
Dr. Bartlett, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I feel something of a kinship with the panel. I noted that Mr. Thompson's from Washington County. I represent the first Washington County in the nation, in Maryland. And Mr. Vail got his one of his master's degree from the zoology department at the University of Maryland. And I suspect before you were born, I got my master's there in 48 and my doctorate in 1952. So I feel something of a kinship with the panel. Mr. Daigger, you noted that the solution to pollution is dilution is probably no longer a very supportable process, is it, without diminishing water supplies. We are one of the few countries in the world probably that flushes its toilets and washes its streets and waters its lawns and washes its cars with drinking water. And I mentioned that to our local water people because I wanted to do something else. In a former life, I was a home builder. And they said, oh, gee, they might drink out of the hose. And my response was, you don't drink out of the toilet, do you? You learn where you drink. And you don't drink from the toilet, so you don't drink from the hose if you're using gray water, right? It's a matter of education, I think. I've got a concern that in all of our development that doesn't have public water and sewer, that we are consuming farmland because it has to perk. And in our area, they won't even perk it if it slopes more than 25%. And so if it perks and doesn't slope any more than 25%, that by definition is farmland. So I wanted to demonstrate that you could live very comfortably without doing that. So I wanted to build a house that had composting toilets or constructed wetlands, so you don't need any connection to the earth for that. And I wanted to build a home where I used rainwater because in our area we have about 40 inches per year, and that's quite enough water to meet all of your needs. And they told me, well, gee, we can't do that because that's cistern water, and we don't drink that. We don't drink rainwater. I say, well, of course we drink rainwater. The rain falls on the hog lot, and then it runs into the stream, and the stream runs into the reservoir, and then you pull it out and treat it and tell me it's drinking water. I say, can I please have the water before it goes through the hog lot? And, they respond with some sanctimonious drivel about they have a responsibility to protect the public health. So my question is, what can we do with these mindless bureaucrats so that we can use these really current technologies to conserve water?
Could I comment? I'd like to comment. I share your pain. We started out with regulatory agencies who said, oh, no, we can't possibly do that. And I'll tell you that the research that we did, that we put into the hands of our regulatory agencies that caused them to change their minds, the hardest thing to do was to get them to fund study of lawbreakers. Because essentially what we wanted to do is look at people who were doing this because they knew it was the right thing to do, but they were doing so illegally. That being said, you have to keep at it, and you have to convince them, just as you did. I think anybody who just heard your statement would say, in a common sense way, it does make sense. I know what goes into my own water. I know what goes into my own laundry. I know what goes out on my yard. it makes a great deal of sense to do it. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be high-tech.
Actually, the systems are very simple, and I built a home that had a gray water system, and we separated the black water from the gray water. Even with the increased price of oil, those plumbing things are still very cheap. It adds very little to the cost of the house if you do it when you build the house. Mr. Chairman, I would like to think about some federal legislation. I'm no big government guy, but sometimes you have to do something that encourages our local jurisdictions to adopt some of these technologies. You could build a home and live very comfortably on the tarmac with composting toilets and constructed wetlands. And by the way, the water that comes out of the constructed wetland, if you have at least 2 tiers of that, is good potable drinking water. They really work very well. The water that falls on the roof of your house, if you have any meaningful sized house, needs all of your water, even without much conservation. And if you don't take it and put it in your cistern, then it becomes a problem, doesn't it? It's now called stormwater runoff. So we built reservoirs to impound it and so forth. What we're doing isn't just dumb, it's really dumb. And we need some education so we change. And any advice that you can give us is the kind of bill that we ought to draft here to encourage our local jurisdictions to adopt these new technologies would be much appreciated. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
A city who couldn't afford a water treatment facility created a system of wetlands that they in turn turned into a tourist attraction for bird watching. And so I would be happy to work with you on your legislation to encourage or incentivize communities to explore ways.
Up in Pennsylvania, there's a small community of, I think, 12 homes or something. It has a constructed wetland. There's a small fraction of this room, and it treats all the water from all of those homes. And to do it in an individual home takes a very small space to do a constructed wetland. It really works very well. And it can be a very attractive garden. It doesn't have to be a swamp. It can be a very attractive garden, and you can actually walk over it if you put the proper kind of material over it and build it properly. Nature does a great job. The water runs off of that hog lot, and by the time it gets down, percolates through the ground, and gets into a spring, it's now pure drinking water. By the way, John Stossel did a study in which he blind taste test, Mr. Chairman, and more people preferred tap water than they did bottled water. And when they actually analyzed it, the tap water turned out to be higher quality than most bottled water. This is a huge ripoff, but everybody believes it's the right thing to do.
How much is it a gallon?
It is more than oil. And $92 a barrel water in the grocery store is more expensive than oil. Thank you.
Congressman Matheson, you're recognized.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a couple of comments and I want to ask questions. First of all, Mr. Vail, I appreciate your suggestion for other items that ought to be considered in the legislation. And I say to the whole panel, that's really the purpose of this legislative hearing. We're putting a bill out there in draft form. As the author of the bill, I'm certainly open to suggestions. I think this whole committee is, and that's the spirit of the Science Committee always, is to try to put together the best bill that promotes public policy. And so beyond your opportunity for direct communication today, if you have any written comments following on what you think we ought to be doing with this bill, I would certainly solicit that from you because we want to make this bill as good as it can be. And secondly, I think it's important to note that this water issue really is relevant as a national issue. We saw some data showing that 36 states in this country are projecting some type of water shortage in the next 5 years. And so while we've got witnesses from Arizona and from my state of Utah, which are known as being dry and arid states, the fact of the matter is this is an issue that encompasses the whole country. And one of the two features of this bill that I'd just like to highlight is the technology transfer section of the bill, because the idea here is that there are a lot of interesting ideas that have been implemented around the country, and we want to create a clearinghouse to make sure everyone can benefit from those ideas. Dr. Bartlett just talked about a small town in Pennsylvania that did something with the wetland opportunity. There are lots of anecdotal stories out there, and the notion of trying to combine that local, on-the-ground knowledge and letting people benefit from them is one of the primary motivations behind the technology transfer section of the bill. couple of questions I'd like to ask real quickly. Mr. Thompson, you mentioned in your testimony that in your county, the per capita water use has dropped by 24% in the last 11 years. Could you give us a quick rundown of which policies or practices really made this water reduction happen?
Yes, I think it was a combination of maybe 3 or 4 things. Well, first of all the cities put in tiered pricing. We ended up with time-of-day watering, which made dramatic improvements, so that, you know, where the hot deserts or at daytime temperatures sometimes are 110, 115 degrees, so we restricted any outside landscape watering, and then general public education to make the public aware of the need to conserve and that they had a public trust to do that.
And I understand that the Washington Water Conservancy District was the first district to partner with the EPA in its Watersense program. So,
well, certainly the first one in Utah.
Yeah. And how has that Watersense program helped you in terms of pursuing the water conservation goals?
Well, it's fairly new. You know, it's not an old program,
right?
So I think the thing that they bring to the table is they've done a lot of research in particularly upgrading fixtures and appliances and building codes and influencing those codes, which have resulted in reduced per capita consumption, particularly in new construction. You take a county like mine, where you know, we've gone from 13,000, 160,000. Most of those homes are new homes, so we're getting the benefit of their research and implementing the low-flow toilets and structures, so you know, that have benefited by new construction. So
I want to ask one question also about. I mentioned the technology transfer when I was just in a couple of brief comments where I went to these questions. Do you, as a local water manager, do you see benefits to setting up this database from the EPA to allow this to happen?
Absolutely. I think it's one of our great mistakes anywhere is we too often try to reinvent the wheel. It'd be nice to know if somebody else has invented it and take advantage of that. And so I think anytime we can get to shared ideas so we don't have to reinvent those, it's a benefit to all of us.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the panel coming here today, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Matheson. I thought this was very informative. I appreciate you all coming. I appreciate the questions from the... Had some ideas. Maybe something will come to fruition from some of those. Work on it. Again, we thank you for your time and your knowledge, your information. Under the rules of this committee, the record will be held open for 2 weeks for members to submit additional statements and any additional questions that they might have for the witnesses. And with that, this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.
Oh, we did.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we need to do that. I have about